This game shows Capablanca at his very best. The end of this game is so unbelievably satisfying, but so is the journey there as we see the incredible strategy of Capablanca. It cannot help but improve our own play, and the final maneuver is one of the greatest executions of chess excellence that has ever been seen. Capablanca has white in this game, played in 1924 at the New York International Masters. His opponent is Savielly Tartakower. Let us jump right in. Capablanca begins with d4, e6 from Tartakower, knight f3, and f5. The Dutch defense, where black tries to control e4 directly with the f-pawn. c4, knight to f6, bishop to g5, pinning that knight, bishop to e7, relieving the pin, knight to c3. One of white's main strategic goals in the Dutch is to play e4. That's often why black will play d5 in a stonewall structure that permanently prevents e4 or makes it very hard. But this is not a stonewall from black. He castles e3 and b6. So black is trying to control e4 with pieces. The knight at f6, the bishop goes to b7 to control e4. Capablanca plays bishop to d3, continuing his fight for the e4 square. Bishop to b7, the bishop goes in the long diagonal. Castles, and queen to e8. Now, this queen maneuver is putting this queen in position for a kingside attack. Tartakower is aggressive here. He doesn't want to play one of those Capablanca endgames. He wants to go for the king. Queen to e2. The queen helps support the e4 push and connects the two rooks. Now, knight to e4. Because Capablanca was ready to go ahead and play e4 here, Tartakower puts a piece on e4, and in doing so permanently prevents e4, well, temporarily I should say actually. Bishop takes e7, and knight takes c3. So Capablanca has to take this knight because black is threatening knight takes queen with check, so he takes with the pawn. Queen takes e7, and now a4. This is an isolated and weak pawn. Capablanca might want to play a5 later to liquidate it and to get it off of the board. And here Tartakower makes a very committal decision. He plays bishop takes knight, intentionally creating a knight versus bishop endgame. Queen takes f3, and he's going to play knight to c6 here. And his idea is to come around and put as much pressure on c4 as possible with these weak pawns here. Maybe the knight can come to a5, the queen can come to c6, maybe at some point later, and just put as much pressure on this square as possible. Knight to c6, rook f to b1, rook a to e8. So Tartakower's main plan, obviously we talked about that knight maneuver, is a direct kingside attack. That's where he is positioning his heavy pieces, and he has two basic maneuvers that he wants to use. The rook can go to f6 and over. It's a classic rook lift, so that rook is positioned to attack. But also this idea of d6 and e5 at some point. I mean, the knight would hang right now if he played d6, but at some point later, d6 and e5 and advance in the center. Capablanca plays queen to h3. That does prevent the immediate e5 from being played, because then the pawn at f5 would fall. So Tartakower plays the rook lift idea. Rook to f6. Now Capablanca's next move, I believe, is strategically brilliant. Now if you put it into your computer, it won't say anything about it. It doesn't even notice it. In fact, it doesn't even think it's one of the best moves. But from a human perspective, it's brilliant. He plays f4, doing two things. One, limiting the scope of the attack on the king's side to 2 files instead of 3, and clamping down on this e5 square, making it much harder for black to play the e5 maneuver. Really frustrating Tartakower's plans. So he shifts to the other idea we talked about, knight to a5, going after that c4 square, and again, perhaps with ideas of b6, c6. So Capablanca plays the queen back to f3, controlling that nice diagonal, keeping control of that c6 square. Black plays d6, the idea of advancing e5. We already know he wanted to do that. Now he's played d6 in support of that move. Capablanca plays rook to e1, though. Placing his rook opposite the queen, he wants to play e4, right? And get an edge that way. Now, in this position, black can play e5, but then a good move for white is actually the immediate e4. And the reason that works is because when black does take on e4, White retakes with the queen and threatens queen to h7 check, and that gains a key tempo in the center of the board with all the exchanges going. And after, say, g6, pawn takes, queen to d5 check, white is a bit better in that position. Black's best move, by the way, is probably c5, which is a very common thematic move when you have these doubled pawns on the c file. But instead, Tartakower plays queen to d7. That does put some pressure on the a4 pawn, and he's also trying to avoid any opening of the e file aiming at his queen, but that does allow Capablanca to break in the center first, which he does with e4. Pawn takes, queen takes, threatening queen takes h7. Check, g6, and now g3, just strengthening this kingside pawn structure and preparing the maneuver h4, h5 to weaken black's kingside pawns. King to f8 is played. King to g2, the possibility again when the h file is opened of moving the rook over. Rook to f7, h4, beginning that process. And now d5. So black wants to lay some claim over this c4 square. The pawn at d5 does that. But Capablanca takes this opportunity to transpose into an endgame. First he takes on d5, pawn takes, and there's exchanges on e8, and now we have an endgame rook and bishop versus rook and knight. Now, if white had a dark squared bishop instead of a light squared bishop, black would probably just be winning here because he could put that knight on c4 and white would never be able to touch it. But at the moment, Capablanca can use this bishop to control this square and also to create pressure on this diagonal leading to h7, which he can accentuate with moves like h5 and rook to h1. And that, of course, is what he does. And it would be a real mistake to take that pawn because after rook to h1, white is clearly better dominating that h file. So Tartakower plays rook to f6, defending g6. Capablanca takes, and now rook to h1. And the rook has control of the open h file. Black plays king to f8. He would like to play king to g7 before Capablanca has a chance to get in, but it's one move too slow. So now rook to h7. On that rook on the 7th rank, his rook is much more powerful than black's, and black cannot play rook to f7 because then just bishop takes g6, takes the pawn and defends the rook, so that would be losing. So he plays rook to c6. That defends the c7 pawn, but also puts direct pressure on Capablanca's c3 pawn. g4, and now knight to c4. Moves like, rook takes pawn, bishop takes here, and these pawns are going to be too strong. So knight to c4. And the knight is well placed on c4, and you might think Capablanca would want to take it off, but he actually thinks that this bishop is more valuable than the knight, so he does not make that exchange. Bishop c4, rook c4, this is probably just an equal endgame. But he plays g5. He knows he wants to win this g6 pawn, and when he does, he wants his pawns to be in a good position. And they control key squares here, f6 and h6. So Tartakower plays knight to e3 check, king to f3. Now this is a very critical moment in this game. He should play probably knight to d1, going after the c3 pawn, and after rook to h6, attacking the g6 pawn, king g7, then f5, trying to take advantage of this pin. But then a move like knight to b2, and it's kind of a messy, sharp end game that's probably slightly in white's favor. But instead, he plays the move knight to f5. And here Capablanca comes up with a brilliant conception. He realizes that piece activity is more important than material. Now, people know that with opening traps and gambits, but the fact that that can be true in an endgame can be a big surprise to people. Capablanca, from this position, plots out a plan that involves the sacrifice of two pawns, but where he gets every piece in a dominant position, so that even though he's down two pawns, he's completely winning. The process begins with this. Bishop takes knight. He takes that knight off of the board, pawn takes. So he's got a protected passed pawn on g5, but at the same time, black is threatening to take on c3 with check, and that's the first pawn that will fall. But Capablanca begins his maneuver, king to g3. Rook takes pawn, check, king to h4. rook to f3. So he's going to lose this f pawn with check also. But he has planned to play g6 and maneuver his king to f6, where even though down 2 pawns, his pieces will dominate. g6, rook takes f4 check, and now king to g5. Gains a tempo on that rook. Black has 2 pawns up, but he is in huge trouble. Rook to e4, king to f6. Notice he's not worried about this pawn right now. That pawn is almost helping white because it keeps black from checking him from behind. He uses it as a shield. King to f6, with the immediate threat of rook to h8 mate on the board. So red alert for black. King to g8, rook to g7 check, king to h8, and now rook takes c7. Capablanca gets back one of the pawns and is threatening mate in 2 here. Rook to c8 check. He could only block it with his rook, and then he would get mated. So black has to react to this mating threat with rook to e8, and now king takes f5. And look, material equality has been restored. 3 pawns versus 3, yet Capablanca's pieces remain in their dominant positions. Rook to e4, king to f6, again with threats of mate. So rook to f4 check to kick the king away, king to e5. Rook to g4, putting the rook behind the passed pawn, but watch this. g7 check. Capablanca is not worried about rook takes g7 because this king and pawn endgame is easily winning. He just moves his king to c7 and escorts the pawn forward, and black is not in time to get there. He would just win easily. So Tartakower cannot take that pawn. He plays king to g8. Rook takes a7. Now Capablanca has a little more material. Rook to g1, king to d5, rook to c1, king to d6, rook to c2. Now d5, rook to c1, rook to c7, offering the exchange of rooks, which obviously would not work because then the d6 pawn would just easily advance. The writing is on the wall, as they say, but Tartakower plays on. King to c6, rook takes a4, and d6. And in this position, Savielli Tartakower resigned, and Capablanca won this game. Obviously, this d pawn, he'd have to give up his rook to stop that. He's just totally lost. A real object lesson in piece activity, which is important in all phases of the game, not just the opening. I hope you've enjoyed this masterpiece from Jose Raul Capablanca. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.